Have you ever been in a situation where you had to make a decision between doing the hard, right thing and the wrong, easy thing? Sometimes when I'm in those situations, I think about the high-powered businessman that I once saw in a New Yorker magazine cartoon. The businessman was looking at his colleagues, and he said, "After all, gentlemen, remember, honesty is one of the better policies." Well, imagine me as a 16-year-old programmer. It was my first job that didn't involve flinging newspapers at things. I walked into that computer room my first day to meet my new boss. His name was AJ, the president of the company. As I walked into that computer room, it was one of those old-fashioned computer rooms, you know, with the high, the white raised flooring, the line printers in the background going, the air conditioning set on stun. But I walked into that frosty computer room and met my new boss, AJ. Now, AJ was kind of an imposing figure. He was tall, he was lanky, had a beard. Kind of looked like, I think, what Abraham Lincoln would look like if he was perpetually mad at somebody. AJ was not an easy guy to work with. So part of my job there was making magnetic tapes that contain customer data, and we shipped them out. I'm sure, Mahesh, you've done that type of thing in your career. Have you ever had a job where there's a half an inch between doing the job perfectly right and totally wrong? And you remember back in the 1970s, remember we wore those big belt buckles? I had a belt buckle that said Boston, not the city, the band. Well, you may be wondering, how are these two things related? Well, as I would step up to the computer console to make these tapes, there was this line of tiny switches across the front, about a half-inch long each. And one of these switches made the difference between making the tape right and making it completely wrong. Now, why did they even put a switch like that on there? And above all, why did they put it at the height of a Boston belt buckle? Well, you may have guessed by now. I think when I was making the tape, I bumped into it with my big belt buckle. Tape got shipped out to the customer, and I thought all was okay. The next day, I walk into the room, and there is my colleague talking with the boss, AJ. They were talking in heated tones. The tape that went out was wrong. There was a problem with it. They weren't talking to me, so I had a few minutes to think about what I was going to do. I thought, well, you know, maybe the problem is with the customer's equipment. Maybe they messed up the tape. And then I thought, no, that's not right. And they'll be able to check that out anyway. And then I thought, well, maybe, and I'm not the only one to handle the tape. Maybe you gave it to somebody else and maybe they messed up the tape. And I thought, no, that's not right either. And then I thought, you know, I hear this time of year, Canada's nice to visit. But as I was standing there trying to figure out what to do, suddenly I saw standing before me Sister Thomas Marguerite. Now, Sister Thomas Marguerite was my first grade teacher at Our Lady of Good Counsel Catholic School in Vienna, Virginia. And she was kind of like AJ in some ways. She was strict. I mean, my knuckles remember that. And she was tall. She was lanky. I don't think she had a beard. Of course, she wore that habit, so who knows. But in some ways, she was very much unlike AJ. And one of those ways is she was strict, but you know it was because she cared about us. You ever have a teacher like that? They're tough, but the reason you know is because they care how you turn out as a person. And Sister Thomas Marguerite would always say to me, and the whole class, she would say, class, always tell the truth. Well, as I'm there in front of AJ and my colleague, Sister Thomas Marguerite's voice comes back to me. Gary, always tell the truth. I looked at her and said, but Sister Thomas, you don't understand. You don't understand AJ. He's a tough man. He doesn't take kindly to this kind of a thing. She looked at me and said, Gary, God wants you to always tell the truth. I thought, oh man, she brought God into the... But then I thought, you know, she's right. So I walked up to AJ and I said, AJ, I know what happened. And I told him the whole truth. Boston belt buckle and all. Well, he looked at me in silence And then he sort of smiled a little. This was strange. I had never seen AJ smile before. Well, except that time he fired that guy. Then he was smiling. But I had never seen him smile before. And he shook my hand and he said, "Gary, thank you for telling me the truth. You just saved the company a lot of money." I walked out of that office that day walking on air. I didn't even care that I was driving my parents' old beat-up 1969 Ford Country Squire station wagon. I was so happy. 2 weeks later, I get my paycheck. In there's a note from AJ. It says, "Thanks again for telling me the truth." And then it says, "But you make too many mistakes. You're fired." Fired? I had never been fired before. I'd never been hired before, but I had never been fired. I walked out of that building that day in stunned silence. Well, fast forward by about 20 years. I'm still a programmer, but now I'm working for a contractor who works for the Federal Aviation Administration. Our boss was a gentleman named John. Now, John didn't look nothing like AJ. He was shorter. He was kind of built like a fire hydrant. But he was a tough man, too. Everybody was afraid to tell John the truth. In fact, all the companies, not just mine, all the companies, they would constantly be trying to spin problems. They'd be try to blame somebody else, try to pass off the blame. So one day, my company, I made a mistake. And we had to go into the meeting with John to explain. All my coworkers were saying, "What are we going to tell him? How are we going to blame this on somebody else? Maybe he won't notice." We got into the meeting, and as luck would have it, John looked directly at me and said, "Gary, what happened?" Once again, all the same thoughts went through my mind. Maybe I can blame it on somebody else. No, I can't do that. But remember last time you told the truth, I thought. Remember what happened? You got fired. And this time, you have a wife and a son and a mortgage. And I thought, Canada seems nice. But once again, I saw Sister Thomas Marguerite standing in front of me and saying, "Gary, always tell the truth." So I kind of cleared my throat, and I said, "John, I made a mistake. No excuses." John looked at me. Honestly, I thought this was the first time anybody had ever told him the truth. He looked at me and he said, "Okay, thanks for telling me. Go fix it." I walked out of that room again, walking on cloud 9. Only this time, there was no pink slip waiting for me. Now, over the years, have I always done the hard but right thing? Have I always taken the path, honesty is the best policy? I'm sad to say I haven't. When I get into a tough situation like that, the thoughts still go through my mind. I still think about passing blame. I still think about going to Canada. But thankfully, so many times, I see Sister Thomas Marguerite standing there and telling me, "Gary, always tell the truth." The next time you're in a situation like that, where you have to make the decision between the hard right thing and the wrong easy thing, remember Sister Thomas Marguerite telling you, always do the right thing. Mr. Toastmaster?
Very good. Thank you. Very nice.